So I got some pretty significant updates here for you guys on Trump's many charges and indictments that he is currently facing ahead of the 2024 presidential election. So just as a reminder before we get to the major news here, 4 major indictments that he's currently facing. Really maybe 3 of these are serious in a legitimate way. You got the hush money, the classified documents case, the election interference case, the Fulton County case down in Georgia with Fani Willis. And this is one we're going to be really focusing more on today. This one is less serious. This is the Stormy Daniels situation, and with Michael Cohen and $130,000 payment to keep her quiet ahead of the election and all of that stuff. And then you got the classified documents one. But the election interference case is the one that's being brought by Jack Smith. The U.S. District Court judge is going to be Tanya Chutkin, and this is for casually trying to overthrow the last election, right? Even though he legitimately lost it, and he's been facing some significant potential consequences from that. And so now we get a huge blow to Donald Trump, specifically on this. Donald Trump cannot have presidential immunity, a U.S. court rules. Okay, so this was the D.C. Appeals Court that was essentially arguing against an absolutely insane Trump team argument that they were putting forward, which is basically that because he was the president, he is therefore immune from any criminal prosecution. And the hypotheticals that were floated throughout this, I'll show you one here in a second, were crazy. I mean, just like lunacy, where they're essentially arguing he could do everything including having his political opponents assassinated by like a SEAL Team 6 squad. And he still would not be able to be prosecuted for that criminally unless there was like an impeachment that was done through Congress, right? So we'll get into all of the details here. They start off saying that we cannot accept former President Trump's claim that a president has unbounded authority to commit crimes that would neutralize the most fundamental check on executive power, the recognition and implementation of election results, the 3-judge panel from the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit wrote in its opinion. They added, for the purpose of this criminal case, former President Trump has become Citizen Trump with all the defenses of any other criminal defendant. They say in a statement shortly after the ruling, the Trump campaign spokesperson Stephen Chung said that the former president respectfully disagrees with the D.C. Circuit's decision and will appeal it, which is basically his strategy, is to just keep these cases going, appeal, until we basically get to the election, and he's hoping that he's going to win the election, and that will then keep him out of jail, right? That's basically what they're betting on here. So even this whole process of just appealing everything is a part of that underlying strategy. They say the case could ultimately go to the Supreme Court, where obviously conservatives hold a 6-3 majority, and where Trump previously nominated 3 of the current judges. And they also add here, if immunity is not granted to a president, so this is part of their defense, every future president who leaves office will be immediately indicted by the opposing party. Mr. Chung said, without complete immunity, a president of the United States would not be able to properly function. I mean, it's ridiculous for a couple different reasons. I mean, obviously, number one, we have not had any presidents, at least to my knowledge, that have been indicted after leaving office. I mean, you had like the Nixon situation, but he was later pardoned, okay? And so he was never, prosecuted after he left office. But like, this is not something that's been happening regularly. They would have you believe that like, we're setting some radical new precedent here where, Obama would then go and prosecute George W. Bush, and then Trump would have prosecuted Obama. I mean, if you commit crimes as the president, you should be prosecuted. And by the way, that does go for Obama, and it goes for Bush, and it goes for Clinton, and every other living president, right? Who you can make a serious case should be indicted for their many crimes committed throughout office, right? But basically what they're saying is that you would never be able to function as a president if you are not granted complete and total immunity no matter what kind of egregious crime that you may commit while in office. Because, then the opposing party is going to come after you. Well, the opposing party, may want to go after you, but if they don't have you on any criminal acts, like the dozens of criminal acts that Trump is being alleged to have committed right now, if you didn't do that, then they wouldn't be going after you. It's not as if, all of this evidence, all of these cases just came out of nowhere. I mean, there is evidence behind them. They're serious cases, right? If he didn't try to overturn the last election and like sick a mob on the Capitol to go halt the counting of the electoral votes, right? If that didn't happen, then guess what? You wouldn't be getting prosecuted for election interference. This case would not exist. If you weren't like a rampant criminal businessman in the state of New York, then you wouldn't have had to face that business fraud trial, right? If you hadn't been defaming E. Jean Carroll a million times every week, then you probably wouldn't have had to pay 80. Like these cases didn't come from nowhere. But that's the argument that a lot of Republicans are trying to use, is that this is all it's politically motivated, instead of it being a conversation about the actual facts of the case, and if you have a dispute about the facts of the case, that's one thing. But if you're just disputing it like as if this is Joe Biden's personal vendetta against Trump, then it's kind of just like delusional. And by the way, using that kind of an argument that these attacks are politically motivated, that's not going to help you in an actual court situation, right? They continue down here saying that the New York Congresswoman, Elise Stefanik, giving us a perspective on how Republicans are looking at this. A potential vice presidential running mate, okay, I doubt that, for Mr. Trump, if he becomes the Republican nominee in this year's election, which he's going to be, said that the decision sets a dangerous precedent, violates our Constitution, and threatens the very bedrock of our nation. So, again, I don't think it sets a dangerous precedent. I think, again, you could probably make an argument that every single U.S. president, you could find something to prosecute them for. I personally don't think that's a bad thing. I think that maybe says something about the office of the president, that you have, repeated criminals taking up this position and committing war crimes and all of these other egregious acts. I think that would set a great precedent, actually, if you could prosecute presidents for crimes that they committed. But also, violates our Constitution, threatens the bedrock of our nation. So holding a former president accountable for crimes that they committed is a threat to the bedrock of the nation, but allowing Trump to get away with all of those crimes with no accountability whatsoever, after literally just trying to keep himself in power when he lost the last election, that is somehow not a threat to the bedrock of the nation. They continue saying that the 3-judge panel, however, said granting a president immunity would pose a threat to the balance of power in the U.S. government, whose 3 distinct branches are supposed to serve as a check on each other. It kind of makes sense to me. They say the Supreme Court, which ultimately could end up hearing this case, has a choice of putting on hold the lower court ruling, refusing to grant such a request, or resolving the immunity question themselves right away. If it chooses the third option, then the justices would make a decision by June. And I'm going to show you guys a schedule of how all of this could play out here, because it's going to get pretty chaotic. They say, but Neil Katyal, a prominent lawyer who has argued cases before the Supreme Court, predicted on Twitter that it will not take up the case, which would be interesting, saying that the argument is so weak and the Court of Appeals decision is so thorough and well done that I could see SCOTUS voting not to hear it, kind of hanging Trump out to dry there, I guess. They say legal analysts said the methodological nature of the appeals ruling, laid out over 57 pages that are dense with court citations and historical references, sent a clear message. What the Court of Appeals said very politely and dryly is, you're not even close. None of these arguments would pass a laugh test. And so what are some of those arguments? Well, here's one of them. Trump team argues assassination of rivals is covered by presidential immunity. This is a real thing that one of Trump's lawyers said. The hypothetical was presented to Trump attorney John Sauer, who answered with a qualified yes that a former president would be immune from prosecution on that matter, or even on selling pardons. I mean, on the one hand, it's kind of funny because of how absurd these arguments are, and thankfully they're not really holding up in court, but it's also pretty disturbing at the same time, right? I mean, this is the lawyer for the former and potential future president of the United States of America saying basically that unless he's impeached and convicted by Congress, that you could not even criminally go after him for having SEAL Team 6 assassinate his political rivals. I mean, it's an absurd argument that has no real grounding in legality in any way, shape, or form, but it also kind of gives you a perspective in terms of what Trump thinks the presidency should be, that it should just be a total, totalitarian kind of position, where you get to do whatever you want, nobody can question you. If anybody gets in your way, then they're in the wrong, they need to be removed from their positions or go after them politically and legally. You can never be held accountable. They say at one point, Judge Florence Pan, another Biden appointee, noted that Trump's legal team argued essentially the opposite case when he faced a second impeachment when he was the president, in this case, for his conduct related to January 6th and the attack on the Capitol. So back when they were dealing with that second impeachment, right, this was something that a lot of even Republican senators were arguing as a part of that procedure, that, oh, you don't need to impeach Donald Trump. Why would we impeach him? If he did something illegal, then the legal system will go after him. And now Trump's team's turning around and making the opposite of that argument and saying, you can't go after us legally or criminally because that's up to Congress. I mean, it's just a complete 180 there. And they finish off here saying that Sauer later argued, again, that the threat of prosecution would have a chilling effect on future presidents' decisions, saying that they would need to look over their shoulder and ask, am I going to jail for this when making controversial? Maybe presidents should be asking that. Hot take here. Maybe presidents should be looking more over their shoulder and saying, damn, am I doing something that could send me to jail? If it would send you to jail, probably don't do it. I mean, they're acting like this is a good argument. Is this really a good argument to people? That the president should never have to question controversial decisions that they're making under the fear that maybe they might be prosecuted for doing something illegal, how about don't do the illegal thing? That kind of makes sense to me, right? I mean, these are real arguments they're putting forward here. Apparently, he's going to have to look over his shoulder to make sure nobody sees him ordering SEAL Team 6 to go assassinate his political rivals. Oh, how terrible would that be, right? And so here's the schedule. So this was posted by Ryan Goodman. And, it's a lot of complicated stuff on how the legal process may play out, in different various circumstances. But the key part is down here in yellow. And I don't know if you guys can see this, but basically no matter what the situation ends up being, you have one here that says the trial can conclude on September 1st, or the trial can conclude as late as like October 19th to the 30th, or a middle ground of like October 5th through the 15th. So essentially, this case could end up where we don't get a final decision on it until like a week or a month before the election actually takes place. I mean, imagine the kind of chaotic situation that we would be in, the unrest that would happen if we get all the way up to a week before the election, especially if it's looking like Trump is going to beat Joe Biden, and then suddenly they have a ruling against him that could potentially have like actual legal consequences for him, criminal consequences for him. And I mean, there's also polling data. I'll skip ahead to this too. There's polling data that shows like this could have a serious impact on how some voters are thinking. Majority of swing state voters in a new poll wouldn't vote for Trump if convicted. So is this the same thing if we're a week out from the election and then suddenly he gets a conviction on one of these cases? Would then people change their mind, and then that could swing the polls from a +6 reality for Trump to like a -4 reality for Biden? Like, who knows how this could possibly play out, right? And we also had this, just to give us a perspective in terms of how wrapped and over the Republican primary is, even with all of this chaos surrounding Trump. I mean, Nikki Haley, because Trump was not on this ballot, just lost the Nevada primary to nobody. to a hypothetical none of these candidates by a wide margin, by the way. 60% to 33%. I mean, Jesus Christ. It's over. It's over. I don't know why Nikki Haley's still in the race, but it's over at this point. And honestly, all of these different indictments against Trump and the charges against him, that's been helping him. It doesn't help him in the general election, as we just saw here, but it does help him in the primary election, because this makes, his base of supporters feel as though he's under attack and we need to consolidate power around him to protect him and to protect the movement. So, I mean, that's like, it's a double-edged sword there for Trump, because yes, it will help you in the primary, but it's definitely going to hurt you in the general election. And we also had this, and I'll finish off with this one. So we have another key decision that's coming up here by the Supreme Court that's essentially surrounding whether or not Trump committed insurrection on January 6th, right? So a little bit on that. They say the issue looms over both the case they will hear this month and the 2024 campaign. Biden and other critics of the Republican presidential frontrunner say that the attack was an insurrection under any definition, and that Trump was clearly the instigator. I mean, listen, I've heard some people have disagreements that this wasn't an insurrection. It was, if you look at the definition of an insurrection, if you look at previous examples where things have been referred to as an insurrection, I don't know how, when you have a president of the United States who is urging his supporters to go march on the Capitol building with the context that if we do not stop the counting of these electoral votes, if we do not keep me as the president and stop this process from taking place, then our country is doomed. Then the evil Democrat communists are going to steal our country away from us and destroy it. When you have that kind of a situation, and Trump's literally, on the Capitol grounds, giving a speech saying you need to fight like hell, we're going to march to the Capitol, I'm going to go march with you. I mean, and then they go and they, break into the Capitol building, chanting, hang Mike Pence, we're going to find Nancy Pelosi, and shit like that. This is 1776. How is that not an insurrection? If that's not an insurrection, I really don't know what an insurrection means at all, right? So on the terminology, I mean, I think that's just sort of like semantics at this point. If the word insurrection has any meaning, it was an insurrection. You don't have to say that it was like on the verge of succeeding, right? That's an argument I've heard people make. Well, do you really think that people who were there on January 6th would be able to take on the U.S. military? No. But that doesn't mean it can't be an insurrection, even if it's a goofy insurrection, even if it's a dumb insurrection that had no real chance on that day of like overthrowing the U.S. government. It could still be an insurrection. And so they note that more than 1,200 people have been charged with crimes related to the events of that day, 850 of them convicted. Trump himself, again, faces 91 charges across 4 cases, 2 of which are related to the 2020 election. But insurrection is not among the charges, I think because Jack Smith thought that would be very difficult to actually prove in a case, so he went for easier charges. And he was also acquitted by the Senate after the House impeached him on charges that included inciting an insurrection. Trump and his supporters then, of course, say that the lack of insurrection charges from Congress say that the term does not apply. The Supreme Court has the power to settle the matter, but it's not clear that it will. The justices are due to hear arguments this Thursday, so tomorrow, and though they are widely expected to resolve whether or not he is eligible for the ballot, remember Colorado, Maine, they tried removing him from the ballot, so this is what that is centering around. They could also choose to decide the case on narrow grounds that sidestep the question of insurrection. So it'll be interesting to see what the Supreme Court does with this. Again, it's going to basically start tomorrow, so we'll have to keep an eye on it. But I mean, whether or not he committed an insurrection to me is pretty cut and dry. I guess you could make some stretch of an argument that it's a loosely defined term, and who could really ever say that it's an insurrection or whatever. But when you look at the 14th Amendment as well, this is also very clear to me. And there have been some people making weaselly arguments about, oh, this doesn't apply to the presidency. Let's just go ahead and read the 14th Amendment here to remind ourselves. Section 14, or Section 3 of the 14th Amendment here. No person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president and vice president, or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state, who having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States or as a member of any state legislature or as an executive or judicial officer of any state to support the Constitution, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. Okay, and Congress can vote to overturn or remove this designation. But I mean, the idea that Trump, even if you're not comfortable with the fact that of saying he directly participated in insurrection, that's not even really in question here. Because also, if you gave aid or comfort to the enemies thereof, the people committing the insurrection, then this would also apply to Donald Trump. And again, there are some people making weaselly arguments to me. I think it's a big stretch. I think that this is pretty cut and dry. And so, there are arguments to say Trump should just be removed from the ballot. And I guess that's what the Supreme Court is going to have to sort of decide over the next couple of weeks. So it'll be interesting. I mean, honestly, I think regardless of how any of this plays out, the next year or so is going to be absolutely chaotic. There's definitely a chance for some level of political violence or unrest at the very least. I think it would maybe be the easiest. I don't want to say the easiest. I mean, maybe the least chaotic if the Supreme Court just said, yeah, Trump can't be on the ballot. Sorry, the 14th Amendment is clear. He aided and gave comfort to insurrectionists, and it is what it is. And then maybe Trump removes himself from public life and cuts some sort of a deal with Jack Smith and then doesn't go to jail or something like that. I don't know, how that's going to play out. But with all of these other charges, man, I mean, with how the scheduling of this is lining up, I mean, with the appeals that Trump and his team are able to do, in all likelihood, a lot of these cases are not going to be decided by the election, or if they are, they're going to end up being concluded like directly before the election, which is just going to make everything even more volatile. So, it's definitely a big L for Trump here in this specific ruling by the D.C. District, Circuit of Appeals. But it's still up in the air exactly how this is going to play out. So we'll have to keep on this. I mean, Jesus Christ, I still can't believe that we're stuck with an election between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, two people who a majority of Americans don't want to run again. So we got one guy who's 4 indictments, 91 criminal charges, business fraud in New York, the E. Jean Carroll stuff, sexual assault, smearing, slandering people. And then on the other side, we have basically like a half brain dead, senile grandpa who a vast majority of people think is too old and incompetent to be president again. And that's kind of where we're at right now in this country.